My name is Terry. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland. Growing up, I was really close to my grandmother. I lived with her for times. My mother and I lived with her for like months or maybe a year or so. And we had a very close relationship. It would be us going to the store, going shopping, cooking breakfast together, her card games that you had with her girlfriends, which were my favorites because I wasn't allowed to gamble, but I knew how to gamble because I would sit around and watch them, but also cook for them. So I was like their private chef. And they would always tip me of like, be like, here's $5 for the sausage that I burnt because I like burnt sausage. But we had a great relationship where we could pretty much like talk about anything. I talked to her about like how school was and how I enjoyed school. We never really talked about sexuality because it was just something that like my family really never questioned with me, really. And then I went away to college, and I remember we would still stay in contact. We would talk at least like once a week, or she would call me, I would call her, most of the time I would call her. And just, she'd be like, oh, how's classes, how's this? Have you met anyone? And I'd be like, yeah, I met this person, I met that person, but like never really about like meeting someone in a relationship type way. After leaving college, I was living in Philadelphia, and I would go back and forth to Baltimore to visit my grandma and like spend days there and like help her move her furniture around because that was something that was like important to her. Like she needed to reorganize her apartment constantly. So I would do that a lot. But then I moved back home to Baltimore where I would see her more often and like drop off waters and things like that. And at that time I met someone, and they were really close friends, so I started introducing them to my family more and like bringing them to family events. So when I brought my friend that I met home for I think 4th of July, and it wasn't like a big deal. Like I introduced him as my boyfriend at that time, and I remember my grandma met him, and she like, I remember her making a face, but like going along with it. I kept introducing him and bringing them together, and she started like liking him because it wasn't just like she'd talk about him as like, how's your friend Aaron doing, and ask about him without me having to bring him up. Because we were also living together at the time. And it was always like very welcoming. She was a very welcoming person. But then she would also introduce him always as, how's your friend doing? And I would always just hear this like black, how's your friend? And I'm just like, okay, that it annoys me, but whatever. At least you identify him as a friend because like we have a friendship before a relationship. I remember once we got engaged, I proposed to my fiance, and I knew I wanted to spend my life with him. And then I entered, like my family had already met him over years, but then we had an engagement party, and I remember we shared our engagement footage because we got engaged, we went skydiving, and so we had the skydiving footage, and like at the bottom of it, I had laid out like, will you marry me? And it was like a surprise for the family watching the video because actually his mom was in town too that same time that we showed the footage. So it was like them getting to meet one part of his family while she getting to meet my family and meeting my grandma. And my grandma is just a personality. But I remember her being like, I wish I got to see this first, or something like that. But then it was like her way of lovingly like being thankful to be a part of like me showing how my form of love and what that meant to me. And then I remember a little bit of time after that, I went to go visit her, and she said, how's your friend doing? And I was like, Grandma, like he's not just my friend anymore, he's my fiance. And she made this face of like, well, you know how I feel about that. And I made a face back to her of like, you know how I feel about that. Like, and she was like, well, I just don't agree with your decision. And I was like, well, my decision is still my decision, and my decision is not going to change because you disagree with it. And she was like, well, I still love you, but I don't agree with it. And I was just like, well, he's not my friend, he's my fiance, and if you don't get that, you don't have to come to the wedding. And I remember her face like completely shifting, and it was like a moment where I was just like, I knew I shouldn't have talked to her like that because it was like rude in how I was raised. But at the same time, I felt like it was just as rude for me to like allow her to continue to see him as just my friend. She was like, well, that's not what I said. That's not what I meant. I'm coming to the wedding. And then we just laughed about it. And it was like our moment of like her moving past it, but also hearing me. And then me also hearing her, but not agreeing with what I heard. So for me, it was a moment where I like I honored myself and who I was to make someone I love even honor me as I saw myself. My relationship with my grandmother is really great. Like, we still talk once a week. When we talk, she asks how's my partner by his name. She also like sends my partner birthday cards, Christmas cards every year, and she like remembers their birthday. And it's kind of funny because even if I'm like in a memory gap, she'll be like, so what are you all doing for their birthday next weekend? Because she knows we also like to travel. She now asks me like, so when are you getting married? And I'm just like, well, after school, or like, and she's like, okay, I'm excited for it, and I can do this and I can do that. So our relationship has only gotten stronger, really. We as humans, we believe that everyone is supposed to understand us and agree with us. But the reality is we have to understand and believe in ourselves enough to like be militant with how we love ourselves enough to like just say fuck that no, like, and a no, and like, it could be respectful no, but it could be fuck that too. But we hold ourselves accountable for how we allow ourselves to be seen and allow ourselves to feel, because yes, my grandma loves me, but at the end of the day, how she was making me feel by calling my fiance my friend was not a form of love in that moment. So like, it's important to be able to tell people how you want to be loved and to walk away from not being loved in the way that you want to be loved.